The boy's hands were shaking when Clyde Granger grabbed them, and that was the thing that broke something open inside the big cattleman's chest. Those small, trembling hands that smelled like dirt and dried tears, and too much fear for a child of 9 years to carry alone. "You listen to me," Clyde said, dropping to one knee right there in the mud outside the collapsed fence line, his voice low and fierce and aimed straight at the boy like a rifle at close range. "Your mama built something real here. Something that took blood and sweat and years of her life, and we are going to help her keep it. Do you understand me? We are not walking away." The boy, Thomas Wallace, stared up at him with his mother's dark eyes, Caroline's eyes, full of storms and stubborn intelligence, and for a second Clyde thought the child might break entirely. But then something shifted in those eyes. Something that had been crumbling found its footing again. "They took the deed," Thomas whispered. "Mr. Harlan's men took it right out of the house." Clyde's jaw tightened so hard his teeth ached. Harlan Briggs. That name had been a dark shadow over the whole of Sweetwater Valley for 3 years now, creeping closer and closer to the one piece of land he had not yet swallowed whole, the Wallace Ranch, sitting square in the middle of everything like a beating heart that refused to stop. "Where is your mother right now?" "In the barn. She won't let anyone see her crying." Clyde stood up, every inch of his 6'2" frame rigid with a kind of controlled fury that men who knew him understood was the most dangerous version of Clyde Granger there was. The version that did not shout. The version that made decisions. "Then we let her have that minute," he said quietly. "And then we get to work." This was the moment everything changed. But to understand why it mattered so deeply. Why a man like Clyde Granger, who had spent 15 years building walls around his own heart, would drop to his knee in the mud and make that promise to a 9-year-old boy, you had to go back to the beginning. Back to a Tuesday morning in April of 1882, when Caroline Wallace first walked into the town of Sweetwater Creek, Texas, with a broken wagon axle, a boy on her hip, and a land grant folded inside her boot. Sweetwater Creek sat in the foothills of the Edwards Plateau, southwest of San Antonio, in the kind of country that was either beautiful or merciless depending on the season. In the spring of 1882, it was doing its best to be both. The hills were green from winter rains, the live oaks budded out silver gold, and the creek itself ran clear and fast through a valley floor that any cattle rancher with half a brain could see was prime grazing territory. That was the problem. Everyone could see it. Caroline had not chosen the town. The wagon axle had chosen it for her. She had been 3 miles out on the post road when the right front wheel dropped into a hidden rut, and the whole rig lurched sideways with a crack that sent Thomas tumbling into the wagon bed and sent her scrambling to keep the horse from bolting. By the time she got everything stopped and surveyed the damage, she was standing in Texas heat with a broken axle, $4.60 to her name, a 9-year-old who was already asking practical questions she did not have answers for, and a land grant for 240 acres of the Sweetwater Valley that she had no idea how to convert into an actual ranch. She did what she had always done when the situation was bad. She assessed what she had, discarded what she could not carry, and started walking. Thomas walked beside her without complaint, which was its own kind of heartbreak. A boy his age should have been complaining. Should have been dragging his feet and asking for water every 5 minutes. The fact that he did not told Caroline everything about what the past 2 years had done to them both since Robert Wallace died of a fever outside of Austin, leaving them with his debts, his land grant, and the kind of grief that either destroys a person or forges them into something harder than they expected to be. She was 31 years old and she had chosen to be forged. Sweetwater Creek was small, a main street of perhaps 10 buildings, a livery, a general store, a saloon, a land office, and a church that doubled as the schoolhouse. There was a hotel that was really just the top floor of the general store. There was a blacksmith, and there was, on the corner across from the land office, a building with a hand-painted sign that read, Granger Cattle Company, Clyde Granger, proprietor. Caroline noticed it because it was the most solidly built structure on the street, because whoever had painted that sign had taken their time. And because as she stood in front of the blacksmith's shop negotiating the cost of an emergency axle repair, the door to the Granger building opened, and the man himself walked out. She noticed him the way you notice a storm coming over a flat horizon, not because you want to, but because ignoring it would be a failure of basic intelligence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his late 30s, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that had some gray at the temples. He wore work clothes, not the fancy dress of a man who only owned cattle on paper. There was dust on his boots from the morning and a coffee cup in his left hand, and he was reading a folded paper with his full attention until he looked up and saw her. She looked away first. She was not in the business of noticing men. She had Thomas to think about and 240 acres to bring into production, and not enough money to do either one properly. But she felt his gaze cross the street and land on her with a weight that was hard to ignore. The blacksmith's name was Pete Ruiz, and he gave her an honest price and told her the repair would take until the following morning, which meant she needed a place to sleep and a meal, both of which would cost money she was trying to preserve. She was calculating this out loud in a low voice, more to herself than to Thomas, when a shadow fell across the doorway of the smithy and she turned. Clyde Granger stood in the opening, coffee cup still in hand, with an expression that was careful and direct and not unkind. "Heard you come in from the West Road," he said. "Axle trouble. Nothing I cannot manage," Caroline said, which was technically true. "Pete's repair is good work," he said, nodding at the blacksmith. "You planning to stay in the valley?" She studied him for a moment, deciding how much to say. "I have a land grant, 240 acres on the south bend of Sweetwater Creek. My husband acquired it before he passed." Something changed in Clyde's expression, not pity, which she would have despised, but something more careful, thoughtful. "The Wallace grant," he said. "You know it." "I know the land," he said. "I tried to buy it from the territory office 6 months ago. They told me it was privately held." Caroline kept her face neutral. It still is, by me." There was a beat of silence in which she was aware that this was either going to go very well or turn into the kind of conversation she was already exhausted by, the kind where a man decided that a widow did not understand what she had and offered to relieve her of it for her own good. Clyde Granger looked at her for another moment, then looked at Thomas, then looked back at her. "I was going to ask if you had a place to stay tonight," he said. "My foreman's wife runs the room above the general store. I can have a word with her if you need a bed for yourself and the boy." That was not what she had expected. She hesitated just long enough to betray the hesitation, which annoyed her. "That is kind of you," she said carefully. "It's practical," he said, with just the smallest edge of something that might have been humor. "You're going to need to know people in this town if you're planning to work that land. Might as well start tonight." He arranged it without making a production of it. By supper she and Thomas had a clean room, a meal that his foreman's wife, a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Dolores Reyes, provided with genuine warmth and no apparent agenda. Thomas ate 2 plates of beans and salt pork and fell asleep at the table, and Caroline sat across from Dolores and listened to what the woman told her about Sweetwater Valley. What Dolores told her, in the careful way of someone who has learned to say dangerous things sideways, was that most of the valley was under pressure. That Harlan Briggs, who owned the biggest spread to the north, had been acquiring land through a combination of legal purchase, forged documentation, and the kind of persuasion that left no marks you could bring before a judge. That several families had already sold or been forced to leave. That the Wallace grant was the parcel Briggs wanted most because it sat at the source of the creek and controlled water access to the whole southern section of the valley. "And what does Clyde Granger think of all this?" Caroline asked. Dolores poured coffee. "Clyde has been fighting Briggs for 2 years, legally, quietly. He has not lost yet, but he has not won either, and he has his own spread to protect." She paused. "He's a fair man. I've worked for him 6 years and I can tell you that plainly." Caroline looked at her sleeping son and felt the familiar combination of love and determination and raw fear that had become the texture of her daily life. "I'm not selling," she said quietly. "I need you to know that. Whatever Briggs offers, whatever pressure comes, I'm not selling." Dolores nodded slowly. "Then you're going to need more than determination, Mrs. Wallace. You're going to need to know how to use what you've got." Caroline rode out to the land grant the next morning, once the wagon was repaired. She took Thomas with her because she took Thomas everywhere, and she took the land grant document from inside her boot and held it in her hand as she stood on the rise above the south bend of Sweetwater Creek and looked at what Robert had left them. It was extraordinary. She had not expected that. She had braced herself for scrub and rock and disappointment, because that was what she had come to expect from the universe since Robert died. But the Wallace grant was extraordinary, gently rolling pasture land along the creek bottom, good grass already coming in thick from the spring rains, a stand of live oaks along the western ridge that would provide shade for cattle through the brutal Texas summers, and at the center of it all, a solid stone foundation where someone had begun a house and stopped. The creek itself ran through the south end of the property, clear and steady. Water. In Texas cattle country, water was everything. She stood there for a long time. Thomas stood beside her. The wind moved through the oaks and the creek sang over its rocky bed, and something in her chest, something that had been clenched so tight since Robert's death that she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without tension, started, very slowly, to loosen. "We're going to build here," she told Thomas. He squinted up at her. "Just us. We'll hire help when I can afford it, and we'll figure out the rest as we go." She spent the first 3 weeks living in the wagon on the Grant property, using the stone foundation as a windbreak at night, building a fire for warmth and cooking. She dug a well with the help of an elderly man named Hector who came by looking for work, and turned out to have 30 years of ranching experience and nowhere in particular to be. She built the most necessary structures in order of urgency: a lean-to, a proper fire pit with a smoke shelf, a chicken coop from salvaged wood, a fence line for the dozen cattle she purchased from a rancher who was selling out 3 counties over and needed a quick buyer. She kept the books herself. She was meticulous and honest, and did not spend money on anything that was not necessary. She was also exhausted in a way that was so constant it had stopped feeling like exhaustion and started feeling like simply what life was. Clyde Granger rode out on a Wednesday morning 6 weeks after she arrived, and he was not subtle about his approach. She could hear the horse from half a mile away, and she came out of the half-constructed house with her work apron on and her hair in a braid and a hammer in her hand that she had forgotten to put down. He looked at the hammer and she saw him decide not to comment on it, which she appreciated. "You've been busy," he said, sitting his horse and looking at what she had built. "I have a lot to do before summer," she said. He dismounted, which she had not quite expected. He stood in the yard, her yard such as it was, and looked around with an expression that was genuinely assessing, not patronizing. She could tell the difference. "The well placement is good," he said. "Hector's work. He showed me how. I dug part of it myself." Clyde looked at her then, and the expression on his face was one she did not entirely know what to do with. It was not admiration exactly, or not just that. It was something more complicated, like he was revising a calculation he had already made. "I came to warn you," he said. She felt the familiar cold tightening in her chest. "Briggs, he knows you're here. He knows you're not selling. He sent a man to the land office last week to look at your documentation." He paused. "I know the land registrar, he told me." "Is the documentation solid?" she asked. "I had a lawyer friend in San Antonio look at it. It's solid." He hesitated. "He'll try something else then. He always does." She studied the set of his face, the way he held his shoulders, the careful control in his eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" The question sat between them. "Because you're in the valley now," he said. "And what happens to your land affects the whole southern water system. And because Briggs has done enough damage here and I'm tired of watching it." Those were all true things. She could see that they were true, but she also had the feeling, standing there in her yard with her hammer and her half-built house and her determination, that they were not the complete answer, that there was something underneath them that Clyde Granger was not quite ready to say. She was not ready either, so she let it stand. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I'll be careful. If you need anything," he stopped, seemed to reconsider. "My foreman, Domingo Reyes Dollar's husband, he's been in this valley 20 years. He knows every inch of it. I'll tell him to come by if you need him." She nodded. He mounted his horse. And then, as he was turning to leave, he looked back at her over his shoulder with an expression that she found herself thinking about for the rest of that day and into the evening, long after Thomas was asleep. The summer of 1882 was hard. She had expected hard, so that was not the surprise. The surprise was the specific shape the hardness took. Harlan Briggs sent a man to her in June. A smooth-faced, well-dressed man named Aldous Croft, who said he was a land agent and who sat at her outdoor table and drank the coffee she offered because she was not going to be rude, and told her that Mr. Briggs was prepared to offer her an extremely generous price for the Wallace grant. More than she could earn from the land in 10 years of hard work. Caroline listened to the whole presentation. Then she said, "No," Croft blinked. "Mrs. Wallace, I encourage you to consider." "I have considered it," she said. "The answer is no." He left, and his pleasant expression went with him, and she was left with the distinct and uncomfortable certainty that this was not the end of it. In July, her fence line on the north section was cut 3 nights in a row. Her cattle drifted twice. She lost 2 head to unknown circumstances. She found them dead at the creek bend with no obvious cause, and the local deputy, a soft man named Garrett who owed Briggs several favors, shrugged and wrote it off as snakebite. She mended the fence. She tracked the cattle. She did not sleep enough. Thomas, to his credit, rose to the occasion in the way children sometimes do when they are given no choice. He was 9 years old, and he learned to ride that summer with the help of a patient old mare she had acquired. And he learned which plants along the creek were edible in an emergency. And he learned to read a clouding sky and the behavior of the cattle. He learned these things because she taught him, and because the land required it. Clyde Granger came by twice more that summer, once in July when he happened to be moving cattle along the south road and stopped when he saw her fighting a section of fence in the afternoon heat, and once in August when he arrived with no pretense at all, just rode up to the house in the evening and sat his horse and said he had heard about the fence cutting. "I know it's Briggs's men," she said. "I can't prove it either," he said, which told her he had tried. "What do I do?" He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of a man who did not have thoughts, the quiet of a man choosing which thought to speak. "You keep doing exactly what you're doing," he said finally. "You stay visible, you stay documented, you keep every piece of paper you own safe and account for every incident." He paused. "And you don't let him see that it's working. Don't let who see what's working. Don't let Briggs see that the pressure is wearing on you." She looked at him in the fading August light. "How do you know it is?" He looked right back at her. "Because you have shadows under your eyes that you didn't have in April, and your left hand has been wrapped since Tuesday, and I don't think you've had anyone to spell you since Hector went to his son's place in June." The accuracy of it caught her off guard. She was not accustomed to being observed. Robert had loved her but had not always seen her. There was a difference, and she had only understood it after he was gone. "I'm managing," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I'm just saying you don't have to manage entirely alone." She was not ready to hear that yet. She thanked him and he rode out, and she stood in her yard in the August dark and listened to the creek and the insects and the settling sounds of the half-finished house, and thought about what it would mean to not manage entirely alone. She could not afford to think about it for long. There was too much to do. The house was finished in September. It was small, 3 rooms, a loft for Thomas, a kitchen area with a proper cast-iron stove that she had saved for all summer, a front room, a bedroom. The walls were stone on the ground floor and timber framed above, and the roof was tight. It was the most solid thing she had ever built, and she had built most of it herself with periodic help from Hector when he came back and from two young men, brothers named Samuel and Elias Vega, who were looking for seasonal work, and whom she paid fairly and on time. The night she moved her bedroll into the bedroom and hung Robert's photograph on the wall and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room she had built with her own hands, she cried. She had not cried since the day she buried him. She had told herself there was no time and had believed it and had been right. But in that room, in that house she had built from the ground up in a valley that had tried to push her out, she let herself grieve fully for the first time. For Robert. For the life they had planned. For the version of herself who had thought everything would go according to plan. Then she wiped her face, set the lamp on the windowsill, and started planning the winter. Fall brought a different kind of pressure. Croft came back in October, and this time his offer was less pleasant and his smile was gone. Mr. Briggs has concerns about the legal standing of your grant, he said, sitting across from her at her kitchen table. There are questions about the original surveying. He believes the documentation may have irregularities. There are no irregularities, she said. She knew this because the San Antonio lawyer Clyde had mentioned, a man named George Marsh who turned out to be someone she could hire herself at a price she could just barely afford, had reviewed every inch of the document and told her it was sound. Courts can take time, Croft said softly. Litigation is expensive. A woman in your position, managing alone. I'm not alone, she said, and the words surprised her even as she said them. I have counsel and I have neighbors and I have a very clear title to this land. If Mr. Briggs has legal concerns, he is welcome to file them with the proper court and see how far they take him. Croft left in a silence that was somehow louder than anything he had said. She waited until she heard his horse on the road and then sat down at her kitchen table and put her face in her hands for 30 seconds. Exactly 30 seconds. Then she got up and started supper. What she did not know, sitting at her kitchen table that October evening, was that Croft had not gone back to Briggs's ranch. He had gone to the land office, and while the land registrar, an honest man named Abel Torres who did not owe Briggs anything, was not in the office, his assistant was, and that assistant was susceptible to the kind of persuasion that came in paper currency, folded small. The deed was not stolen that night. The theft came later in November, on a night when Caroline and Thomas were in town getting winter supplies and the ranch was empty. Someone broke the lock on her document chest. She had not yet been able to afford a proper safe, and took the folded deed from where she kept it with her other papers. She came home to find the chest forced, and the deed gone and Thomas standing in the kitchen doorway looking at her with those two old eyes of his, and she had to choose, right there, between falling apart and doing the next necessary thing. She chose the next necessary thing. She saddled her horse in the dark and rode to Clyde Granger's ranch. His spread, the Double G, sat 3 miles north of her property on higher ground above the valley. It was a proper ranch, a large stone house, barns, a bunkhouse for the hands, fenced pastures where she could see cattle moving even in the moonlight. The house had lights burning and she rode up to the front gate and stopped there, not certain she should knock this late, and was still deciding when the front door opened. Clyde stepped out onto the porch. He must have heard the horse. He had a lantern and he held it up, and when he saw who it was his whole posture changed, not toward alarm but toward something more focused. "What happened?" he said. It was not a question. She told him. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done he put the lantern down on the porch railing and stood quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking, the way his eyes went distant and calculating while the rest of his face stayed still. "The copy," he said. "Marsh will have a copy of the documentation from his review." She had not thought of that. The relief was so sudden it made her dizzy. "He copied the deed. He should have. He's thorough. First thing tomorrow we telegraph San Antonio." He looked at her steadily. "Can you stay tonight? I'll have Dolers set up the spare room." "I can't," she started. "Caroline." He said her name for the first time, and something in the straightforwardness of it stopped her. "Your property is unsecured and someone just broke into your house. "You're not going back there tonight alone with your son," she wanted to argue. She was very good at arguing for her own independence. But Thomas was 9 years old and she had a lock that did not lock any more and someone who was comfortable breaking into her home. "All right," she said. "Thank you." That night, lying in the spare room of the Double G while Thomas slept in the small room across the hall, she listened to the sounds of a house with more people in it than her own, the low murmur of voices from somewhere, the settling of timbers, a dog's movement on a wooden floor, and she thought about what it meant that her first instinct had been to ride to Clyde Granger. She had known him for 6 months. She did not know him well. She knew he was fair, and she knew he was serious, and she knew he was fighting the same fight she was, just from a stronger position. She knew that when he said he would do something, he did it. She knew that he looked at her in a way that was different from how men usually looked at women in her situation, without condescension, without predation, without that particular brand of false gentleness that was really just another form of not taking her seriously. She did not know, yet, what to do with any of that. In the morning, Clyde sent a telegraph to George Marsh in San Antonio while she sat in his office and watched him write it out. He was meticulous. He included specific references to the documentation details that told her. He remembered every word she had told him about the deed's contents, despite the months that had passed since she had mentioned them. Then he called his foreman Domingo into the office and spoke to him for 15 minutes about positioning extra hands along the valley roads that ran adjacent to her property. "You don't have to do that," she said when Domingo left. "I know," he said. "I can't pay you back for. I'm not asking to be paid back." She stopped. He was standing at the window with his back half turned to her, and the morning light was on the side of his face, and he looked in that moment like someone who was carrying something heavy and doing it without complaint because that was simply what you did. She recognized that. She recognized it in her own bones. "Why do you care what happens to my ranch?" she asked. Her voice was quieter than she had intended. He turned from the window and looked at her, and the careful control in his eyes slipped for just a moment, not far, but enough to show her something underneath it. "Because you built something real," he said. "Because I watched you build it from nothing in 6 months, and it is the most extraordinary thing I have seen anyone do in this valley in 15 years. And because," he stopped, looked at her with an honesty that was almost uncomfortable in its directness. "Because I would like for you to still be here a year from now." She did not know what to say to that. She held it quietly inside her chest and said nothing, and he did not press her, and they moved on to the practical matters that needed handling. Marsh's office telegraphed back by midday. He had copies. He would send certified versions by the next stage. He also noted, in the careful language of a man who wrote every important thing in writing, that the original deed had been recorded with the county land office at the time of filing, and the county record was a legal equal to the original document. Abel Torres, the registrar, confirmed the county record was intact. Harlan Briggs had not managed to get to that. The relief was real, but so was the understanding that Briggs would try again. What Briggs tried next was something she had not anticipated, and it came at the end of November in the form of a lawsuit filed with the district court, claiming that the original Wallace land grant had been issued in violation of a prior claim by Briggs's own holdings. A claim that appeared to rest on a document that had been, conveniently, recently discovered. "Forged," said George Marsh, who arrived in Sweetwater Creek on the southbound stage in the first week of December, because the situation had progressed past what he could manage by correspondence. He was a small, precise man of about 50 with spectacles and the kind of intensity that came from decades of not letting sloppy work slide. He sat at Caroline's kitchen table with the lawsuit document spread before him and shook his head slowly. "This is a fabrication. The survey dates are internally inconsistent. The signature of the original land commissioner is a reasonable forgery but not a perfect one." He looked up at her over his glasses. "This will cost money to fight." "How much?" He told her. She did not let her face change. Inside, her chest was tight. She had built up a small reserve over the summer and fall. She was careful and the cattle were doing well, and she had sold enough at the fall market to feel cautiously stable. This lawsuit would eat through that reserve in months. "Is there a path to winning?" she asked. "Yes," said Marsh without hesitation. "It is a fabricated document. I can prove it. But it takes time, and it takes court appearances, and it takes the kind of sustained legal pressure that wears people down." "He's counting on it wearing me down," she said. "He is." She was quiet for a moment. Thomas was at the table doing his arithmetic and pretending not to listen, which was something she had come to understand about her son. He heard everything and filed it away and did not panic, which she hoped meant she was raising him right and not just raising him without enough protection. "Then we don't let it," she said. Marsh filed the counter documentation before Christmas. The court date was set for March. December settled over the valley cold and clear. Caroline's cattle were wintered down, her stores were adequate, and she had, in the logic that comes from having too much to do to feel sorry for yourself, found a kind of rhythm to her days that felt almost like peace. Almost. Clyde Granger came for supper on a Thursday in December. She had invited him, a thing she had done carefully and with full awareness of what it might mean, on the grounds that he had done a great deal for her, and she was capable of expressing gratitude through hospitality. She made a proper meal. Thomas helped her set the table with the good tin plates she had brought from Austin. He arrived precisely when he said he would, with a bottle of apple brandy from a farm in the hills that he set on the table without ceremony, and he ate her cooking with the full attention of a man who understood what good food cost in terms of time and effort. They talked about the lawsuit first because it was the largest thing, then about the cattle because that was next, then about Thomas, who answered Clyde's direct questions about school with direct answers that were unusual for a boy his age and made Clyde nod slowly. "You're doing the Vance Reader?" Clyde asked Thomas. "Finished it. Mrs. Torres has the next one." "What else are you reading?" Thomas considered this seriously. "My mother has a surveying book. I've been reading that." Clyde looked at Caroline. She shrugged. He picked it up himself. "Can I see it?" Clyde asked Thomas. Thomas brought the book, a dense, technical volume on land surveying and measurement that she had bought in San Antonio, because she needed to understand the physical realities of her own property. And Clyde sat at her kitchen table and went through it with Thomas for half an hour while she cleaned up, and she listened to them talk and felt something very warm and very dangerous settle in the region of her heart. After Thomas went to the loft, she and Clyde sat by the stove with the apple brandy and the December quiet outside, and talked the way people talk when they are comfortable with each other, and also slightly afraid of how comfortable they have become. "He's remarkable," Clyde said, nodding toward the loft. "He's the best thing I've ever done," she said simply. "How old were you when you had him?" 22. "Robert and I had been married a year." She paused. "He looked like Robert when he was small. Now he mostly looks like himself." Clyde was quiet for a moment. "How long were you married?" 8 years, until he died." She looked at the stove. "He was a good man, not always practical. He had large ideas, and sometimes the ideas outpaced the execution. But he was kind, and he was honest, and he loved us very much." She paused. "The land grant was his large idea. He bought it on faith from a man who was selling up, sight unseen, the spring before he got sick. He never saw it." "Do you resent it?" Clyde asked, quiet, direct. She thought about it genuinely. "No, I did at first. I was furious that he left me with a piece of paper and a debt and a child and not enough of anything practical. But then I came here and I stood on that ridge and I saw what he had bought and I understood. He had good instincts about land." She looked up. "He just didn't live long enough to build it. So you built it for him." "I built it for us," she said. "Me and Thomas. Robert already went somewhere. He doesn't need pasture land." Clyde made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the neighborhood of one, and she looked at him, and his face in the firelight was open in a way she had not seen before, and she felt the dangerous warmth again, stronger. "What about you?" she asked. "Have you always been in Sweetwater Creek?" He shook his head. He told her carefully, in the way of someone who does not tell this to many people, that he had come to the valley 12 years ago from Kansas, where he had worked cattle on the trail drives for 7 years before he had enough saved to buy his own land, that he had no family here, that he had come alone and built the Double G alone, first on leased land and then on purchased land and then expanded it piece by piece over a decade of careful work, that he had been engaged once to a woman in Kansas, but that she had not wanted to come to Texas and he had not wanted to stay in Kansas, and they had parted ways without bitterness. "You've been alone a long time," she said. "I've had Domingo and Dollars," he said. "And the hands, it's not exactly alone. You know what I mean." He met her eyes. "Yes," he said quietly, "I know what you mean." She looked away first, again. She was starting to wonder how long that was going to last. January was cold and February was colder, and she spent both months preparing for the March court date and running the ranch and teaching Thomas his lessons in the evenings when the light lasted long enough in being. She would later realize, gradually and completely, and almost without noticing it, in love with Clyde Granger. It happened in increments so small she could not have said when any one of them occurred. It was the way he remembered things she had said weeks before and responded to them as if the conversation had never stopped. It was the way he treated Thomas, not as a burden or an appendage or something to be managed, but as a person whose thoughts were worth hearing. It was the way he never once suggested that she could not handle something, even when handling something was clearly hard, and yet also never pretended the hard things were not hard. It was the afternoon in late February when she was mending harness leather at the outdoor table, and he rode up and without asking sat down beside her and picked up the other end and started working the needle through the stiff hide with the competence of a man who had done it 100 times, and they worked side by side in the cold afternoon sun for 2 hours and talked about nothing of great importance, and she thought, without quite meaning to, "This is the best afternoon I have had in 2 years." The court date in March was in San Antonio. She and Marsh traveled together on the stage. Clyde rode along. She had not asked him to, and he had not asked her permission, had simply appeared at the stage stop that morning with his horse saddled and told her he had business in San Antonio and might as well travel the same road. She knew it was not business in San Antonio. She chose not to say so. The court proceeding was 2 days. Marsh was meticulous and uncompromising, and presented the evidence of the forged document with the precision of a man dismantling a machine piece by piece, methodically, without dramatic gesture, in a way that was more devastating for its quietness. The presiding judge, a white-haired man from Bixar County named Honorable James Whitfield, asked sharp questions and took careful notes. On the second afternoon, Harlan Briggs arrived in person for the first time. She had not seen him before, had known him only through Croft and through his effects on the valley. He was older than she had imagined, perhaps 60, with a heavy face and pale eyes, and the specific kind of confidence that comes from having had things go your way for long enough that you have forgotten they could go any other way. He looked at her across the courtroom with an expression she recognized as assessment, and she looked back at him without looking away, and she saw the moment he recalibrated. He had expected her to look frightened. She did not. Judge Whitfield's ruling came the following morning. The Briggs claim was unsupported by credible evidence. The Wallace land grant was affirmed in full. The lawsuit was dismissed with costs assessed to the plaintiff. Caroline stood in the corridor of the court building and listened to Marsh explain what all of it meant in practical terms, and felt a shaking start somewhere deep in her torso that was the release of months of sustained tension, and she put her hand against the wall to steady herself. Clyde was standing a few feet away. He had not been in the courtroom. He had waited in the corridor both mornings out of a delicacy she had not expected from him. When she came out, he read her expression, and his own changed. Something came into his face that was relief, and something else she did not name immediately. He crossed the corridor and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him and said, very quietly, "We won." He did not say anything. He just put his hand over hers where it rested against the wall and held it there, and that was enough. They rode back to Sweetwater Creek on the third day. Marsh took the stage. She and Clyde rode together on the long road north, and the country opened up around them. The limestone hills and the cedar, and the early spring wildflowers coming up through the grass along the road. And they talked for hours the way you can only talk with someone when the crisis has passed, and you are left with the person underneath it. She told him things she had not told anyone. About the fear she had carried all winter that she would lose the land and have to take Thomas somewhere else, and start over again from less than nothing. About the particular loneliness of being a woman trying to do serious work in a world that was constantly suggesting she should be doing something smaller. About the moments, rare but real, when she had stood in her kitchen before anyone else was awake and thought, "I cannot do this," and had then gotten dressed and gone out and done it anyway. He told her things in return. About the loneliness he had described before, but in more detail now. The way building something alone had been a kind of freedom when he was younger and had become, slowly, a kind of ache. About the specific hollowness of coming home to a silent house after a hard day and having no one to tell about it. About watching her build the Wallace ranch from nothing over the course of a year and feeling, for the first time in a very long time, something that felt like the opposite of aloneness. "Clyde," she said. They had stopped at a creek crossing to let the horses drink, and the afternoon was going golden around them, and the words came out before she had fully decided to say them. "I need you to tell me what you mean by that." He looked at her from his horse 2 feet away with the creek running and the light in his eyes. "I think you know what I mean," he said. "I do," she said. "I want you to say it." A beat. He was quiet the way he was always quiet before he said something important, not evasive, just careful. "I love you," he said. "I have for some time. I didn't think it was useful to say it while you had a lawsuit hanging over your head and a ranch to hold together." The simplicity of it, the straightforward honesty. No ornamentation, no performance, just Clyde Granger telling her the true thing. "I love you too," she said. "Which has terrified me for approximately 4 months. He made a sound, a short, low laugh of relief, and shook his head. "4 months, same." She looked at him, he looked at her, the horses drank. "What do we do about it?" she asked. "I don't know," he said honestly. "What do you want to do about it?" She thought about the Wallace ranch, the house she had built with her own hands, the land that the court had just affirmed was hers. The life she was building for Thomas, for herself, for a future she was choosing on her own terms. "I don't want to give anything up," she said. "I'm not asking you to," he said immediately, like it was not even a question. "I mean the ranch, my name. My right to run my own property the way I see fit. Caroline." He said her name the same way he always said it, straight, clear, like it meant something. "I have never once tried to manage you. I don't intend to start." She studied him for a long moment. "No," she said slowly, "you haven't." They rode the rest of the way back in a different kind of quiet. Not the careful quiet of 2 people navigating dangerous territory, but the warm, open quiet of 2 people who have said the true thing and are now simply in it. Spring came to the Wallace Ranch and Sweetwater Creek in a rush, that April wildflowers on every hillside, the creek running high and cold and clean, the cattle spreading out into the new grass with the restlessness of animals who have been confined all winter. Clyde did not move too fast. He was, as she had come to understand, a man who understood that important things took time and that rushing them was a form of disrespect. He came to supper twice a week. He helped when help was needed without making it servitude or charity. He talked to Thomas as though Thomas's opinions were worth hearing, which was the fastest route to Caroline's heart that anyone could have taken. Thomas, for his part, was not naive. He was 10 years old by April, and he had his mother's intelligence and her tendency to observe more than he said. One evening in late April, when Clyde had come for supper and they had sat on the porch after, and Thomas had gone to bed without being asked, Caroline mentioned to Clyde that her son had been unusually quiet. "He's thinking," Clyde said. "About what?" "Probably about me," Clyde said simply. "About what I mean." Have you talked to him? No. I thought I'd let him come to it. The following Saturday, Thomas came to it. He found Clyde in the barn, where Clyde had come early to help with a fence repair, and he stood in the barn door in his work clothes with his characteristic directness and said, "Are you going to marry my mother?" Clyde looked up from the fence post. He did not smile, which was the right instinct. Thomas did not want to be treated like a child. He set down his work and gave the boy his full attention. "I'm hoping to," he said, "if she'll have me, and if you're agreeable." Thomas considered this with great seriousness. "She built this ranch herself." "She did," Clyde agreed. "She doesn't need anyone to do it for her. I know that." He paused. "That's one of the reasons I love her." Another long silence. The horses moved in their stalls. Light came through the gaps in the barn boards. "She cried when she finished the house," Thomas said quietly. "She didn't know I saw. She sat on the bed in her room and she cried for a long time." Clyde was quiet. "She worked really hard," Thomas said, "and nobody helped her except Hector and the Vega brothers, and they were paid workers." "She worked very hard," Clyde said. "I don't want anyone to hurt her again," Thomas said. Clyde looked at him steadily. The boy's eyes were his mother's eyes, dark, direct, full of a seriousness that had been put there too young. "Neither do I," Clyde said. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen. But Thomas, your mother is going to protect herself regardless. She doesn't need me for that. She's the strongest person I know." Thomas looked at him for another long moment. Then he nodded once, a small, decisive thing, and picked up the other end of the fence post and helped Clyde carry it to where it needed to go, and that was that. It was in May, on a clear evening when the valley was so beautiful it seemed almost fictional, that Clyde asked Caroline to marry him. He did not have a ring, or rather, he had one, simple and gold and plain, that had belonged to his mother, and that he had carried in a coat pocket for 2 months trying to decide when was the right time. He asked her in her kitchen, not on a cliff overlooking a dramatic sunset, not in the middle of a crisis, but in her kitchen after supper with the dishes still on the table and the lamplight warm and the sound of Thomas's voice from the loft reading aloud to himself the way he did before sleep. He put the ring on the table and said, "I want to marry you. I want to be here for whatever comes next. I know you can do this alone. You've proved it past any doubt. I just want to do it with you." She looked at the ring on the table. She looked at him. She thought about all of it, the year she had lived in this valley, the ranch she had built, the fight she had won, and the man across the table who had stood beside her through all of it without ever once trying to stand in front of her. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He put the ring on her finger and she laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, because the ring fit perfectly, and she had not expected that, and somehow the simple rightness of it seemed to say everything. Thomas came down the loft stairs 3 minutes later, supposedly to get water, and looked at the ring on his mother's hand and the expression on Clyde's face, and made the very good decision to simply fill his cup at the kitchen bucket and go back up to bed without saying anything, although the sound that floated down from the loft a few minutes later was unmistakably a boy trying not to laugh. The wedding was in June of 1883, in the church schoolhouse, small and practical and exactly right. Dolores Reyes cried happy tears, and Abel Torres witnessed the legal documents, and Hector, who had come back to the valley for the spring, danced at the celebration held afterward in the yard of the Wallace Ranch with more energy than a man of 70 had any right to possess. There had been a question of names, of what she would be called, of what the ranch would be. She kept Wallace as the property name because the land grant was filed under that name, and because it represented something she had fought too hard for to change. She was, legally and in all practical matters, Caroline Granger, but the Wallace Ranch remained the Wallace Ranch, and Clyde not only accepted this but had never suggested otherwise. Harlan Briggs attended neither the wedding nor the celebration. He had, following the court ruling in March, pulled back from his more aggressive tactics, not out of goodwill, but out of the calculation of a man who understood that certain fights were no longer worth the cost. The judge's ruling had been public, and the costs assessed against him had been substantial, and the fabricated document had become an embarrassing matter that had circulated through the county legal community in ways he found uncomfortable. He had not surrendered his ambitions entirely, but he had become, at least temporarily, quiet. That quiet lasted through the summer of 1883, which was the best summer Caroline could remember. The ranch was productive. Her cattle herd had grown to over 60 head. The creek bottom grass was excellent, and she had hired the Vega brothers on permanently and added a third hand, a steady man in his 30s named Ben Colton who had worked trails for years and wanted a settled place. She and Clyde did not merge their operations. They discussed it and decided against it. The Double G ran on its own logic and the Wallace Ranch ran on its own, and both were better served by remaining distinct entities with a shared household. The shared household was, it turned out, one of the most profound and practical changes in her life. To have someone at breakfast who thought about the same things she thought about, in approximately the same serious way. To talk through problems at the end of the day with someone whose judgment she respected, and who respected hers in return. To have Thomas, who had always been close to her, develop under the steady attention of a man who had patience and time and genuine interest in who the boy was becoming. Thomas grew fast that year. He was 10 going on 40, Dollar said, which was not wrong. Clyde worked with him on weekends, not forcing things, just including him in the work of the ranch in ways that were appropriate and interesting, teaching him the things a boy needed to know to run land responsibly. How to read the quality of grass, how to assess a fence line's integrity, how to watch the sky for weather signs, how to talk to the cattle hands respectfully and be respected in return. "He's going to be something," Clyde told Caroline one August evening. "He already is," she said. "I mean something more than we can imagine yet." She watched her son walk across the yard in the evening light, tall for his age, careful and quick and full of that particular brightness that had never quite been extinguished despite everything, and thought that Clyde might be right. The threat they had set aside returned in September 1883, and it returned with a new shape. Harlan Briggs had not been idle. He had been conducting his business more carefully, buying out 2 smaller operations to the north of his original holdings, consolidating, acquiring water rights along the northern tributary of Sweetwater Creek in ways that were entirely legal. And now he had a new strategy. He applied to the county commission for a road easement. Specifically, an easement for a new road that would run along the eastern edge of the Wallace Grant, crossing a corner of Caroline's property through what happened to be the best section of her creek bottom pasture, ostensibly to connect Briggs's expanded northern holdings to the main south road. The application was legal. The easement, if granted, would be a technical encroachment on her land, small in area but significant in impact, cutting through the best grass she had and creating a right-of-way that could be expanded over time. "This is the new approach," Clyde said. They were at the kitchen table with the application document between them. It was late, Thomas in bed, the lamp burning low. "He can't break your deed. He can't manufacture a claim, so he's going to chip away at the edges. Can we fight it?" "Yes." Road easement applications require a public comment period and a commission vote. "We get 30 days to submit objections." He looked at her steadily. "And we need people in that room who will speak." "Neighbors," she said. "Neighbors," he agreed. What happened over the next 30 days was the thing that later she would point to as the moment she understood what it meant to have built something real. She had not, in the urgency of her first year, thought much beyond her own fence line. She had been so focused on her own survival that she had not fully seen the shape of the community around her. Clyde saw it. He had been here 15 years, and he understood the web of relationships and debts and alliances that made up a community. He rode out with her to the other valley ranches, to the Garza family on the eastern flats, to the McBride widow on the north road, to the Torres family, to 3 or 4 smaller operations she had met in passing but never really known, and he let her do the talking. This was deliberate, and she understood it was deliberate, and it moved her deeply. In every conversation, when the ranchers or their families turned to him as the established, known presence, he redirected them to her. "This is Caroline's land that's at stake," he would say. "She'll explain it better than I can. She explained it." She explained it clearly and practically and without drama, laying out the application and its implications in terms that every rancher could understand, because every rancher understood what water access meant. The community response surprised her. Not because it was large. It was not large. There were maybe 30 families in the valley, and many of them were cautious people who had seen what resistance to Briggs cost. But because it was real, people came to the commission meeting. They signed the written objections. Abel Torres spoke. The McBride widow, a formidable woman of 60 named Ida, gave a statement that was 3 sentences long and completely devastating in its plainness. The commission denied the easement application 5 days after the meeting. Briggs appealed. The appeal was heard 2 months later and also denied, because the objections to record were extensive, and the commission's lawyer found the original application procedurally flawed on 2 counts. Harlan Briggs, at 70, with a damaged court record and an increasingly expensive and unsuccessful campaign against the Wallace grant, contracted pneumonia in the winter of 1883 and died in February of 1884. It should perhaps have felt like a larger moment. In fact, it felt like the quiet after a long storm, not dramatic, just the gradual recognition that the drumming on the roof had stopped. His holdings were auctioned to settle his debts. The valley reorganized around their absence with the naturalness of water finding its level, and life on the Wallace ranch continued into spring. She was 4 months pregnant by the time she understood it fully. She had not told Clyde yet, had been carrying it with careful, private attention for several weeks, learning the shape of it, adjusting to the enormous and vertiginous fact of it before she said it aloud. She told him on a Tuesday morning in March, standing in the kitchen in the early light while Thomas was still in his loft, over a cup of coffee. She simply put the coffee down and looked at him and said, "I'm going to have a baby." He went very still. Then something in his face moved. "Opened" was the word that came to her in a way she had not seen before, though she had seen many things in Clyde Granger's face over the past 2 years. "When?" he said. "August. I think August." He came around the table to her in 3 steps and took her face in both hands and looked at her with such unguarded joy that she felt tears come up without warning and blinked them back furiously. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm more than fine. I just needed a little time to know what I felt about it before I told you." "And what do you feel?" She thought about the question honestly, which was the only way she knew to think about questions. "Frightened," she said, "and grateful, and," she searched for the word, "full. I feel very full." He kissed her then, not with urgency but with the kind of tenderness that she had come to understand was his specific expression of the deepest things, and held her in the kitchen in the morning light, and she listened to his heartbeat and thought that this was the opposite of the woman who had walked into Sweetwater Creek 2 years ago with a broken wagon and a folded land grant and $4.60. Not because the woman had been wrong. She had been right. She had been exactly right about everything that mattered. But there was a difference between being right alone and being right with someone beside you, and she was only now in this moment in this kitchen, fully understanding that difference. Thomas came down the loft stairs at his usual time, stopped when he saw them, and assessed the situation with his customary intelligence. "Something happened," he said. Caroline laughed. She could not help it. "Yes," she said. "Something very good," she told him. He was quiet for longer than she expected. Then he said with great deliberateness, "Is it going to be a boy or a girl?" "We won't know for months," she said. He considered this. "Either is acceptable," he said, which made both Caroline and Clyde laugh in a way that Thomas found mildly insulting and entirely worth it. The summer of 1884 was the best one. The cattle operation at the Wallace Ranch had reached a size that was generating real income, not just survival income but growth income. She had expanded the fence line on the eastern pasture, improved the water management along the creek to sustain better year-round grass, and added a small but productive kitchen garden that supplied vegetables through the season. Clyde's Double G continued to run well, and the two operations collaborated where it made sense, shared equipment, complementary market timing, the kind of practical alliance that made both stronger without compromising either. She kept her books with the same meticulous care she had always brought to them. She knew to the penny what she spent and earned, and she made her decisions based on reality, not hope. This was the thing Robert had sometimes struggled with. His large ideas had occasionally outpaced what the numbers could support. She had always been the steadier one with accounts, and she carried that habit into everything she built. In August, 3 weeks before the baby was due, she was sitting on the porch in the evening with her feet on the rail and her accounting book in her lap. She could not do much heavy work now, and accounting was something she could do while sitting. When she looked up and saw Clyde coming across from the barn, and the way he moved in the long summer light, easy and certain, with the dust of the day's work still on him, struck her with an emotion so complete and dense she had to look away for a moment to process it. 2.5 years ago, she had walked into this valley with nothing. And she had built not just the ranch, though the ranch was real and solid and producing, but something larger and harder to quantify. A life, a full one, a life with room in it for love and work and community, and a son who was growing into someone extraordinary, and a man who had never once made her feel small. She looked back at Clyde, and he had stopped a few yards from the porch, watching her with the particular expression he kept for moments when he caught her thinking. "What are you computing?" He asked. "Everything," she said. "Is the sum favorable?" She smiled at him, and it was a different smile than the one she had arrived in Sweetwater Creek with, which had been a working smile, a functional expression deployed for practical purposes. This one was unguarded and complete. "More than favorable," she said. He came up the porch steps and sat beside her, and she leaned against him with the accounting book still open in her lap. And the valley went gold and then rose and then quiet around them. And the creek sang from the south end of the property, and the cattle settled, and the evening came in easy and warm. The baby was born in August, as she had predicted, on a Tuesday afternoon. She was meticulous about prediction as well as accounting. He was a boy. He was loud and healthy and had, from the very first hour, his father's dark eyes and his mother's expression, which was to say an expression of someone who had already decided he was going to understand everything and was simply waiting for people to explain it. They named him James Robert Granger. James for Clyde's grandfather, Robert for Thomas's father, who deserved to live on in something. Thomas, who had declared that either was acceptable, stood at the foot of the bed and looked at his baby brother with an expression she would never forget, something between awe and the beginning of a new kind of responsibility, and said very quietly, "He's very small." "He'll get bigger," Clyde said. "I know," said Thomas. "I'm going to teach him surveying." The years that followed were full years. James grew fast and loud and cheerful in contrast to his older brother, who remained thoughtful and precise, and took his role as elder brother with a seriousness that was both effective and occasionally exasperating. Caroline ran the Wallace ranch with the expertise of someone who had done it long enough to make it look easy, though anyone who looked closely could see that the ease was earned, built on a foundation of years of hard, meticulous work that did not stop just because it had become familiar. The cattle operation grew. She added 20 head in 1885. 30 more in 1886. The creek bottom pasture she had fought so hard to keep proved to be as valuable as she had known it was. Water was king in Texas cattle country, and the south end of Sweetwater Valley had it in quantity and quality. Several neighboring ranchers began informal arrangements with her around water access, arrangements that were equitable, and that she managed with the same careful honesty she brought to all her dealings. Clyde's Double G expanded north into former Briggs land that came available at the Briggs estate auction. He bought 300 acres that added to his already substantial holding, and the combined economic weight of the Double G and the Wallace Ranch made them the central pair of the valley's cattle economy, without either of them having sought that particular distinction. They were known in the valley as people you could trust. This was not a small thing. In a place and time where trust was scarce and often abused, the reputation of Caroline and Clyde Granger for fair dealing, for honest accounting, for the kind of help that did not come with strings attached, was the kind of currency that compounds over time. In the spring of 1886, George Marsh came to visit from San Antonio and remarked, sitting on the porch of the Wallace Ranch with a glass of Caroline's lemonade, that he had never had a client's case conclude with such a thorough and complete reversal of fortune. "That's a lawyerly way to put it," she said. "I am a lawyerly man." He smiled. "But I mean it in the best sense. When you walked into my office in January of 1883 with a stolen deed and a forged claim against you, and a son who was trying to be braver than any child should need to be, I was not certain of the outcome." "Neither was I," she admitted. "And now," he said, looking at the ranch, the solid house, the full pastures, the new barn addition they had put up the previous fall, James chasing a chicken in the yard while Thomas watched with resigned older brother energy, This, she agreed. The summer of 1887 brought something she had not planned for, which was a drought. Not the worst Texas drought in memory, there had been worse, but dry enough to stress the grass through July and August, and require the kind of careful, precise resource management that was the difference between ranchers who survived hard years and those who did not. She had planned for it, not specifically for that drought in that year, but for the category of things going wrong, which she understood was simply part of the long game of running land in Texas. She had built the ranch's water management carefully over 5 years, the well positioned for maximum access, the creek channeled through the pasture in a way that distributed it more evenly, the grass rotation managed to prevent overgrazing, the reserve feed stores maintained at a level most ranchers considered excessive. When the dry July came, she did not panic. She did not sell cattle at distressed prices the way 3 ranchers to the north did. She managed carefully, and the herd came through leaner than she liked but intact. And when the fall rains finally came and the grass came back, she was positioned to benefit from it while others were still recovering. Clyde watched all of this with the expression she had come to know as his particular form of admiration, not the showy kind, but the quiet, solid appreciation of someone who understood what he was looking at. "You were ready," he said. "I try to be ready for the things I can be ready for," she said. "How do you know what those are?" She thought about it. "Experience," she said, "and paying attention." Thomas turned 14 in 1887 and was, by that point, as capable a ranch hand as any adult on either property. Not because she had pushed him into it, but because he had gravitated toward it, absorbing the work of the land with the same appetite he brought to his books, which he still read with ferocious attention. She had continued his formal education through correspondence courses and through Clyde's considerable personal library, and he was, by any measure, better educated than most boys his age in a 100-mile radius. He was also, she noticed with a combination of amusement and parental resignation, beginning to notice girls. Specifically, he was beginning to notice Maria Garza, the eldest daughter of the Garza family on the Eastern Flats, who was 13 going on 30, and had a mind like a steel trap wrapped in a pleasant social manner that deceived people who were not paying attention. Caroline said nothing about this. She waited. She trusted her son to navigate it with the same thoughtfulness he brought to everything. She also quietly mentioned to Clyde that he might consider having a conversation with Thomas about respectful behavior, which Clyde did, and which Thomas found deeply embarrassing in the way that all good advice from parents is embarrassing when you are 14. James, at 3, was primarily interested in cattle, horses, dogs, and the question of whether frogs could be kept indoors. He was not yet old enough to be interested in girls or books, and his conversations were enthusiastic and specific, and often included more detail about frogs than any adult required. He was the most thoroughly joyful person Caroline had ever known, and she suspected this was partly his nature, and partly the fact that he had grown up in a house with enough security and love and stability to let him simply be himself. She thought sometimes about what Thomas might have been if he had grown up in the same circumstances, if Robert had not died, if the move to Sweetwater Creek had been planned and supported rather than desperate and improvised. She did not know the answer, and there was no point in wondering. Thomas was who he was because of what had happened, and who he was someone she was profoundly proud of. The same circumstances that had been hard for him had made him. She thought this sometimes when she stood on the ridge above the South Bend and looked out over the valley, when the light was right and the cattle were moving in the pastures below, and the creek caught the afternoon sun in pieces of silver light. She had come here in desperation with $4.60 and a land grant folded in her boot. She had built something real. In December of 1888, Caroline discovered she was pregnant again. She was 38 years old, which was not too old but was not young, and she told Clyde with a mixture of joy and something more complicated, and he held her hand and told her whatever came, they would face it. What came was a healthy girl, born in the summer of 1889, in the same room where Caroline had first slept in the house she had built with her own hands. She was small and fierce, and had a set of opinions from her first week of life that made her parentage immediately evident to anyone who knew the family. They named her Eleanor Rose Eleanor for Caroline's mother. Rose because Clyde had been, in private, quietly growing a climbing rose along the south wall of the house for 2 years, and it had bloomed that spring for the first time in a spectacular cascade of pale pink that still made him look pleased when he looked at it. Thomas, 17 and already talking about studying land law in San Antonio, held his new sister with the careful precision of someone who understood that he was holding something important. James, 5, was mostly interested in whether Eleanor would eventually be able to play with him, and having been told this would take approximately a year, accepted it with the pragmatism of a rancher's child accustomed to waiting for things to develop. "She looks like you," Clyde told Caroline. "She looks like herself," Caroline said. "Same thing," he said, and she laughed. The years turned. Thomas did go to San Antonio to study at the law college there, at 17, with the focused ambition of a young man who had watched his mother fight for her land in court, and decided he wanted to be the kind of lawyer who helped people like her. He came home for harvests and holidays and brought books and long letters in between, and Caroline read every letter twice and kept them in the document chest. The one with the proper lock she had finally acquired, a heavy iron thing that nothing short of a serious effort with a pickaxe could penetrate. James grew into a boy of remarkable practical intelligence, not the book-focused precision of his older brother, but a deep, intuitive understanding of animals and land, and whether that made him, by 10, an indispensable presence on the ranch. He had Clyde's steadiness and Caroline's eye for detail, and his own particular warmth that made the cattle hands like him and the horses respond to him, and even the neighbors' dogs make a detour to greet him when he was nearby. Eleanor grew into something none of them had quite anticipated, which was a person of enormous creative intelligence who wanted to draw everything she saw, the cattle, the hills, the creek, the faces of the people around her, with a determined precision that suggested she was trying to understand the world by recording it exactly. By the time she was 6, she had filled 2 notebooks with drawings that were remarkable for her age. By the time she was 8, she was teaching herself proportion from an art instruction book that Clyde had ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio, because he had noticed her looking at the illustrations in his surveying books and understood what she was after. Caroline watched her daughter with a particular joy that was different from what she felt watching her sons, not more or less, but differently shaped. Alina was fierce in a way that was familiar, and Caroline recognized it and named it in her own heart as something worth protecting and cultivating rather than redirecting. By 1895, the Wallace Ranch was one of the most productive operations in the southern Edwards Plateau. It had been written up in the San Antonio Express as an example of successful small ranching, done with intelligence and discipline. The article named Caroline Wallace Granger by name, which she found embarrassing and which Clyde found entirely appropriate. Thomas, practicing law in San Antonio, kept a copy of it on his office wall. Harlan Briggs was 10 years dead. His name came up occasionally in local history conversations, and always as a cautionary tale, not a legacy. His land had been redistributed and built into things by the families who had bought it, and the valley was better for his absence. Abel Torres had retired from the land office, and his son, also Abel, ran it now with the same careful honesty. Dolores and Domingo Reyes were still on the Double G, older and somewhat less active, but still the moral center of Clyde's operation. Hector had died in 1890, peacefully in the winter, and had been buried on the Wallace property at his own request, because he said it was where he had done some of his best work. Pete Ruiz still ran the smithy. He had once remarked to Caroline that fixing her wagon axle in 1882 was the best thing he had ever done for the valley, and she had agreed that it was a very good axle repair. The evening of her 44th birthday, in the April of 1895, Caroline stood on the porch of the house she had built and watched the last of the sun move down behind the western ridge, and Clyde came and stood beside her, and they were quiet together the way they had learned to be quiet together, completely present, completely easy. 12 years in Sweetwater Creek. 12 years since she had walked in with a broken axle and a land grant in her boot. 13 years since she had stood on this ridge and looked at the land Robert had bought in faith and decided she was going to build on it. She had built something real. She had been told that once by the man beside her on a mud-soaked morning with her sons shaking hands between them and a crisis around them. She had not been surprised to hear it because she had known it herself, but she had been grateful to hear it from someone else because the knowing and the saying were both true and both mattered. "Thomas is coming for the summer," Clyde said. "He telegraphed this morning." "I know, I got the same telegraph. He's bringing someone." She turned to look at him. "Is he?" "Maria Garza, I believe." She looked back at the ridge. Maria Garza, now Maria Garza of San Antonio, assistant teacher at the girls' school near Thomas's law office, whom Thomas had been corresponding with for 2 years in letters that were entirely proper and entirely transparent in what they were. Caroline smiled. "He's taking his time," she said. "He's being careful," Clyde said. "He learned it from his mother." She looked at him sidelong. "I was not that careful. You told me I terrified you for 4 months. That's exactly what I mean." He laughed, the full, unguarded laugh she had been hearing for 12 years, and still found one of the best sounds she knew. And she leaned against him, and the valley settled into its evening colors, and the creek ran soft and steady from the south end of the property, and James's voice carried up from the barn where he was doing the evening feeding, talking to the horses in the low, constant way he had. Alina appeared at the porch door with her notebook and her pencil, and sat on the top step, and began to draw the ridge line in the last of the light. Her head tilted with the focus of someone who is trying to see exactly the thing in front of them rather than the thing they expect to see. Caroline watched her daughter draw. She watched her husband watch the hills. She listened to her younger son talk to horses. She thought about Thomas coming home in the summer with Maria Garza and the beginning of something new. She thought about the morning she had stood on the ridge with Thomas, who was 9 and brave and terrified and carrying everything, and had told him, "We are going to build here." They had, all of them in their different ways, had built here. The ranch, the family, the life. The full, complicated, hard-won, extraordinary life that had grown up from a piece of paper in a boot and a broken axle and $4.60, and one woman who had decided, in the face of everything, to stay. The ridge went dark. The first stars came up. The creek sang. The house behind her, The house she had built with her own hands, with the climbing rose on the south wall finally fully grown and sending its pale pink blooms up toward the eave, was warm with lamplight and the sound of a family at the end of a good day. She breathed in the night air, cool and cedar-scented and familiar, and she was content in a way that was not the absence of challenge or hardship or the hard work of tomorrow. It was contentment that knew all of that was still true and rested in something solid underneath it. She had built something real. She was still building it. And beside her and around her and underneath her feet was all the evidence she needed that the building had been worth it. Clyde put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into the solid warmth of him, and they stood together on the porch in the dark while the valley breathed around them, and that was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough and more. Summer came in on the heels of a good May rain, and Thomas arrived on the northbound stage on a Thursday morning with Maria Garza beside him. A composed, intelligent young woman of 22 who shook Caroline's hand with the firm directness of someone who had learned to establish herself clearly, and looked at the Wallace ranch with an expression Caroline recognized immediately as the expression of someone who understood what they were looking at. She liked her immediately, with the instinct she had developed over 13 years of being a person who paid close attention to people. Thomas proposed to Maria that summer, on the porch in the evening, in full sight of the family because Thomas was not a person who made important things invisible. Maria said yes with a quiet smile that managed to contain considerable feeling without any performance of it, and Caroline thought they were very well matched. The engagement party was held in the yard of the Wallace Ranch, the same yard where Caroline and Clyde had held their own celebration 12 years before, and half the valley came because the Grangers were the kind of people whose celebrations drew half the valley. The Garza family came from the eastern flats, all of them, including Maria's father Diego, who shook Clyde's hand with the solemnity of two men who understood each other's respect for land and family, and did not need to say much to communicate it. Hector's grave, at the edge of the oak stand to the west, had wildflowers growing on it because Aliner had planted them in the spring, which was exactly the sort of thing Aliner did. James, 11, attended the party in the full awareness that he would rather be checking on the cattle, but was here because family was important, and there was excellent food. Abel Torres gave a toast that was 3 sentences long and entirely appropriate. Dolers cried, which was also appropriate. And Caroline Wallace Granger stood in the yard of the ranch she had built and looked at the people around her, and at the man beside her, and at the boy who was no longer a boy but a man with a plan and a woman and a future, and at her daughter, drawing in her notebook in the corner of the yard with a cup of lemonade balanced on her knee, and at her younger son sneaking a second piece of cornbread with the practiced subtlety of someone who has not yet learned that he is not subtle at all. And she thought, this is what building something real looks like, not the single moment of arrival or the single victory or the single recognition. Not the day the court ruling came or the day the deed was confirmed or the day the fence was finally secure. Not even the day Clyde said I love you on the road north from San Antonio, with the creek running and the light in his eyes. All of those things added together, accumulated, layered like good soil on good rock over years of rain and sun and work and love and stubbornness and the refusal to stop. That was what building something real looked like. She had done it. They had done it. And they were not done yet, because the ranch would go to James one day, and Thomas would practice law and protect people like his mother, and Aliner would draw the world into comprehensible shape with her pencil, and there would be grandchildren, and the creek would keep running, and the rose on the south wall would bloom every spring, and the cattle would move through the valley grass, and Sweetwater Creek would remain exactly what it had always been, and what she had chosen it for, a place where something real could grow. If you were willing to do the work. She reached over and took Clyde's hand without looking at him, and he took it back without hesitation, the way he always did, And they stood together in the yard of the Wallace Ranch in the Texas summer evening, and the world was full and good and exactly right.